It has been said that the Philippines spent 3 centuries in a Catholic convent and 50 years in Hollywood. For the sake of factual precision, let's note that it was actually just 48 years of American rule over the island nation. But even that number, though it may mark only the halfway point of a human life, represents an eternity in the realm of politics. In that span of time, the Philippines lived under 9 different American presidents, including one who served twice as long as most. Each of those 9 administrations brought with it a different ideology, a different foreign policy approach, and a different sense of what this far-flung territory meant to American interests. At one end of that spectrum was William McKinley, who famously couldn't even locate the Philippines on a map. At the other stood Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who would make the island central to his war plans against Japan. Although Philippine independence wasn't the primary or even secondary concern of most of these administrations, each in its own way nudged the nation along the road to sovereignty. But make no mistake, the desire for independence came from the Filipino people themselves. Commodore George Dewey, confident in his ability to hold Manila as long as necessary, nonetheless cabled Washington with a stark warning. The locals, he said, would resist the Americans with the intense hatred born of race and religion. It seems more than probable that we will have the so-called insurgents to fight, as well as the Spaniards. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon the relationship between the United States and its first colony, the Philippines. Episode number 3, Democracy on the Rocks. From the onset of America's existence, a portion of its population sought to justify their actions through the idea of a greater good. John Winthrop famously proclaimed that the United States was a shining city on a hill, an example to others around the world. The belief in manifest destiny saw colonists transform into a nation, which then became a colonizing force, expanding from sea to shining sea through a series of purchases, land grabs, and wars. While Americans today tend to think of manifest destiny as a benevolent mission, there was a deeply racial component at its core. Native Americans were pushed off their land and isolated, rather than integrated into the beating heart of the new American nation. A nativist backlash targeted those deemed less invested in the American experiment, including European immigrants, Chinese migrant workers, and people of African descent in the Southern Territories. The United States gained California, New Mexico, Arizona, and more through the highly successful U.S.-Mexico War. But it could have had more. American troops occupied Mexico City, one of the largest and most vibrant cities in history. Indeed, what is now Mexico City was once Tenochtitlan, the most populated urban area in the world in the pre-modern era. So why didn't the U.S. insist on seizing Mexico's capital city as part of its expansion plan? John C. Calhoun, one of the more despicable figures in American history, explained it in a speech to Congress. For the record, he stated, "To incorporate Mexico would be the very first instance of incorporating an Indian race, for more than half of the Mexicans are Indians, and the other is composed chiefly of mixed tribes. I protest against such a union as that." Calhoun finished with the statement, "Ours, sir, is the government of a white race." The Treaty of Paris in 1898 ended the Spanish-American War, granting the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States for $20 million. These new acquisitions were immediately dubbed territories. It seemed that this moment, 50 years after Calhoun's objections to adding diverse populations to the Union, America was ready to embrace what William Howard Taft would later call its little brown brothers. At least that's what it seemed to the new acquisitions. After all, throughout its history, territories were the first step towards becoming full-fledged states. Yet more than 120 years later, Puerto Rico and Guam still await their star on the American flag. Historian Daniel Immerwahl reveals that these conversations were happening at the time of the acquisition, and race played a central role. He notes that the imperialists most excited about claiming, for example, the Philippines, were steadfast that the Philippines shouldn't become a state in the same way Kansas passed from territory to state. He adds that the one determinant that is most important is the presence of a large white settler population. Hawaii never had the kind of white settlement you see in Western territories like Minnesota, but it nevertheless hosted a significant white population that made it more palatable for statehood from the mainland's perspective. The same is true of Alaska. So why bother paying $20 million for territories you never expected to join the nation? History books tell us that it was to facilitate a global network of military bases, fulfilling Alfred Mahan's vision of establishing a worldwide naval presence. But territorial acquisition, especially of remote islands, also allowed for darker, more nefarious objectives. Dr. Cornelius Rhodes, a Harvard-trained oncologist, traveled to Puerto Rico for a series of experiments that sound more like Nazi horrors than American history. Rhodes apparently forgot to pack his Hippocratic oath. Instead of curing locals, he induced illness, including cancer, in his patients. We know about these experiments because Rhodes left behind a private letter, discovered by one of his Puerto Rican lab assistants. The letter revealed open, unvarnished racism prevalent in American society at the time. Rhodes wrote, "I'm tempted to take it. It would be ideal except for the Puerto Ricans. They are beyond doubt the dirtiest, laziest, and most degenerate and feverish race of men ever inhabiting this sphere. It makes you sick to inhabit the same island with them. They are even lower than Italians. What this island needs is not public health work, but a tidal wave, or something to totally exterminate the population. It might then be livable. I've done my best to further the process of extermination by killing off 8 and transplanting cancer into several more. The latter has not resulted in any fatalities so far. The matter of consideration for the patient's welfare plays no role here. In fact, all physicians take delight in the abuse and torture of the unfortunate subjects." The remote island proved a viable lab for evil men like Dr. Rhodes, who would later influence the discovery of chemotherapy, a treatment that has saved countless lives. Likewise, for better or worse, America would experiment in the Philippines, engaging in a nation-building effort that still offers lessons for today's world. But first, they had to take possession of what they had purchased. Emilio Aguinaldo was the recognized leader of the Filipino Freedom Forces that allied with Commodore Dewey during the American takeover. Before fully committing to the cause, Aguinaldo asked the American leadership about their intentions. He was given the simplistic reply that America was very great and rich and did not need colonies. Dewey even offered to put the statement in writing, aiming to reassure the doubts of his Filipino ally. Of course, naval commanders aren't authorized to make such grandiose proclamations, but no one in the Philippines knew that. Historian Stanley Carnow writes that to the Filipino insurgents, Dewey personified the power and purpose of the United States. In fact, he was operating in a policy vacuum. Whatever he actually said, Dewey probably planted in Aguinaldo's head, perhaps inadvertently, the notion that America would not seek to control the Philippines. Carnow also points out that Dewey underestimated Aguinaldo, who was thinking ahead. The Filipino leader had stepped up his campaign to occupy as much territory as possible before the arrival of U.S. ground forces. Thus, he calculated he could improve his bargaining position with the Americans. For the same reason, he decided to declare the independence of the Philippines. That announcement came via official proclamation on June 12, 1898. Although invited, Commodore Dewey, the highest-ranking American on the island, informed Aguinaldo that he had been too busy to attend because it was a mail day. Aguinaldo picked up several clues that he was being played during the removal of Spain's legacy forces from the islands. The best response he could extract from any American envoy was that America's historical record of never taking colonies should suffice. Yet when a 4th of July party invitation addressed him as general rather than his preferred title of president, Aguinaldo knew that something behind the scenes had changed. As his demands increased, the newly arrived General Wesley Merritt asked President McKinley for permission to be done with it all and to handle the Filipinos the way Americans had treated the indigenous natives of their own continent, by wiping them out. Denied the opportunity for ethnic genocide, Merritt distanced himself from his allies who were working behind the scenes to deal with the remnants of the Spanish Empire, who would only surrender to the Americans. The unnecessary subterfuge turned deadly when the two imperial powers agreed to maneuver their forces in a premeditated manner to allow the Americans to take the capital city of Manila without firing a shot. Believing the troop movement to be genuine, a group of Filipino soldiers joined in, terrifying the Spanish into firing on the column. 6 Americans and 49 Spaniards lost their lives as a result. Carnow tells us that angry at the apparent betrayal by the Americans, Aguinaldo's top strategist forecasts worse ahead, telling his boss that the conflict is coming sooner or later, and we shall gain nothing by asking in favor of them what are really our rights. Aguinaldo could have been blamed for gullibility. By trusting the Americans and not attacking Manila before U.S. forces landed, he was denied a role in Spain's defeat, an outcome he had struggled towards for 2 years. Dewey and Merritt also barred him from the surrender ceremony. McKinley was famously indecisive, inspiring the popular joke of the time, "How is the president's mind like a bed?" The answer? Because it had to be made up for him before he can use it. With Cuba having been granted independence, something Aguinaldo had already declared for his own nation, McKinley was finally forced to clarify America's intentions in the Philippines. Initially, he considered simply keeping Manila as a trading post and naval coaling station. But the ease with which Dewey had captured Manila Bay suggested that such a plan would be indefensible. Gradually, McKinley converted to full imperialist, claiming that God had presented him with a list of options, and the best one was to educate and Christianize the locals so they would not fall into the hands of more dangerous colonial powers. On that basis, he denied a Filipino representative the right to attend the Paris Peace Conference. In Manila, American forces quickly shifted from conquerors to administrators, establishing police forces, clinics, and sanitation systems, overhauling the local practice of relieving oneself in a hole dug in the floor of their homes. Meanwhile, Aguinaldo continued to build a parallel government, complete with a constitution and an elected assembly. But rather than a grassroots movement, this new government was dominated by wealthy elites. Major General Elwell Stephen Otis, a Civil War veteran whose claim to fame included staring down Sitting Bull in Yellowstone, was placed in charge. Otis assured McKinley that he would not yield to any of their requests or make any concessions. The effort to convince the locals that America intended to be benevolent was off to a terrible start, both abroad and at home. By this time, the Anti-Imperialist League had already formed, boasting star power such as Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and Grover Cleveland. However, the League failed to make a significant impact because its members differed widely in their reasons for opposing seeking an empire. Some, unfortunately, even basing objections on racist superstitions. Their lobbying prevented the war from escalating further, but it was impossible to keep bored soldiers entirely focused on the bigger political picture. On February 4, 1899, a routine patrol ignited the Philippine insurrection. During congressional testimony, General Arthur MacArthur, yep, that's right, somebody named their kid Arthur MacArthur. He admitted his troops had fired first, saying simply, it was getting hard to restrain them. Carnell writes that the ensuing war fueled controversy in the United States, as many Americans grew weary of an overseas venture that, like the Vietnam War 2 generations later, gradually lost its original luster. Unlike Vietnam, however, the U.S. eventually prevailed, though fighting persisted in parts of the island chain long after President Theodore Roosevelt formally declared victory in July 1902. An estimated 200,000 people died, the overwhelming majority Filipino civilians. The relentless heat, torrential rains, and pervasive disease balanced out American military superiority, prolonging the conflict for nearly 3 years. Aguinaldo repeatedly sought to diffuse tensions, but the Americans believed that once the fighting had begun, they were destined to finish it. With only 24,000 ground troops initially, the U.S. found it impossible to hold territory beyond Manila. Another 40,000 soldiers arrived, including 2 African-American regiments known as the Buffalo Soldiers. One black soldier asked why he was there, mockingly replied, "We've come to take up the white man's burden." Even these reinforcements weren't enough to expand America's foothold significantly. A compromise eventually emerged through a citizen-led commission that proposed granting the Philippines political autonomy under a U.S.-led civil service, a revamped justice system, new public works, and universal education. It was essentially self-government under close supervision, a babysitter state. Aguinaldo was willing to accept this deal, but Otis, the leading American military figure who resented any civilian interference in his command, rejected it outright. Like many soldiers under his command, Otis harbored openly racist views of the Filipino people. Carnell records some of these sentiments. No cruelty is too severe for these brainless monkeys who can appreciate no sense of honor, kindness, or justice. He also said, "I'm in my glory when I can sight some dark skin and pull the trigger." Another soldier claimed the islands would not be pacified until the locals were wiped out like the Native Americans. It is crucial to remember that at the turn of the 20th century, the U.S. military was staffed with officers hardened by brutal wars, mostly the Civil War and the Indian Wars. even the best men seemed to lose their moral compass. Captain Matthew Baston, who ordered an entire town annihilated, wrote home, "We come as a Christian people and bear ourselves like barbarians." With violence escalating, troops became obsessed with revenge, which only fed the cycle of brutality consuming the land the U.S. hoped to pacify. Still lacking a coherent policy, President McKinley was reelected by a landslide in 1900. Eager to find a solution, he appointed William Howard Taft, an Ohio lawyer with grand ambitions for the Supreme Court, to head a commission to fix the situation. When Taft inquired as to why he was chosen, McKinley replied, "We have got them, and in dealing with them, I think I can trust the man who didn't want them better than I can the man who did." Taft accepted on condition that the president consider him for a future Supreme Court appointment. Otis was soon replaced, and authority transferred to Taft's civilian commission. Historian Glenn Anthony May called this phase an experiment in self-duplication, aiming to reshape Filipino society in America's image. The commission spent a year gathering intelligence on Filipino history and culture. Taft reserved the toughest subjects for himself, including civil service reform, public lands, and resolving the issue of Spanish friars. He set up a legislature to pass laws and won the cooperation of Filipino elites, trading favors for their loyalty. Though labeled traitors by many of their countrymen, these early supporters of Taft's Federalista Party formed the backbone of governance under American supervision. The Federalistas looked to America's past for inspiration. Party President Pardo de Tavera told observers that he could see the day near at hand when George Washington will not simply be the glory of the American continent, but also our glory, because he will be the father of the American world, in which we shall feel ourselves completely united and assimilated. Taft gave the Federalistas every chance to succeed. He banned opposition parties, granting them a monopoly on official jobs, and set up a patronage system that would eventually rot the government from within. Aguinaldo, however, refused to accept his diminished role. He continued leading a guerrilla war against the occupiers. Unable to achieve decisive victories, his forces descended into brutal tactics, castrating American prisoners, burying others up to their necks, and wedging sticks into soldiers' mouths before leaving trails of sugar to attract ants. Despite Taft's relative success elsewhere, violence persisted. One American colonel justified increasingly hostile actions by citing the Bible, saying the Almighty had destroyed Sodom. Yet Taft managed to turn high-level captives into collaborators, offering them prominent roles within the pro-American Federalistas. Faced with death, most accepted the new allegiance. Betrayed by his top men, Aguinaldo was pushed further from Manila's halls of power. In February 1901, a captured courier revealed a coded letter requesting 400 men for a secret mission. U.S. officers assembled a regiment filled with loyalists and set off to capture what was believed to be Aguinaldo's hideout, hoping to end the insurgency with one decisive strike. 5 American commanders disguised themselves as prisoners to join the regiment. Rather than arriving in spectacular fashion, the unit attempted to appear as battle-weary veterans, but miscalculated their food supply, turning the ruse into a genuine hardship. They learned another group of 400 men had recently arrived at the hideout, but continued onward, finally presenting themselves to Aguinaldo for inspection. Summoning a few regimental leaders to discuss strategy, Aguinaldo was stunned to hear what sounded like a 21-gun salute and begged his men to stop wasting ammunition. When one of the disguised officers pulled a gun on him, Aguinaldo asked, "Is this not some sort of joke?" 3 weeks later, he publicly declared, "Enough of blood, enough of tears and desolation." By acknowledging and accepting the sovereignty of the United States throughout the entire chain of islands, as I now do without any reservation whatsoever, I believe that I am serving thee, my beloved country. My happiness be thine. It was clear the statement was forced. Afterwards, Aguinaldo adopted the habit of wearing a black bow tie in public as a symbol of mourning for his lost nation. His rebellious spirit resurfaced during World War II, when he broadcast pro-Japanese propaganda, falsely believing that another imperial conqueror might free him from American rule. President McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist during a state visit to Buffalo, becoming the third American president to be killed in office, following Abraham Lincoln and James Garfield. At the time, the President of the United States did not yet have the protection of the Secret Service. Signs that the trip might be ill-advised appeared early, when a ceremonial 21-gun salute blew out the windows of McKinley's train car with 3 poorly positioned cannons. While attending a regional version of the World's Fair, McKinley relaxed the standard security protocol requiring attendees to present empty hands when approaching the president. The intense heat of the day allowed for an exception, resulting in the crowd being allowed to carry handkerchiefs. The assassin used this leniency to conceal a handgun beneath his cloth. McKinley was shot twice in the stomach. Unfortunately, the most qualified doctor available was a gynecologist with no experience in treating bullet wounds. Amazingly, McKinley initially pulled through, and the nation breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing he would make a full recovery. That hope vanished 8 days later when an internal infection proved fatal. With McKinley's death, Theodore Roosevelt became the 26th President of the United States. His ascendancy marked a dramatic full-circle moment for Roosevelt, who had quietly agitated behind the scenes to ensure the Spanish-American War occurred in the first place. He had been added to the McKinley ticket largely to silence him. Some Republicans openly fretted about putting what they called a lunatic just one heartbeat away from the presidency. The anarchist bullet shifted American leadership from plutocracy towards progressivism. The stock market reacted immediately, dropping 6% with the loss of its most reliable champion. Now the boisterous, self-styled man of the people assumed command of the nation, just as the crisis in the Philippines entered a critical phase. Roosevelt initially continued McKinley's policy of strategic neglect, looking the other way as American soldiers swept through the island nation, labeling nearly every victim as an enemy combatant, regardless of age or gender. That approach ended after the Balangaga massacre jeopardized Roosevelt's electoral ambitions. The ambush took place on the island of Samar, orchestrated by one of Aguinaldo's lieutenants who refused to surrender alongside his commander. Posing as a helpful local leader, the Filipino officer offered to clean the town in preparation for a church service to mourn the recently assassinated American president. On the eve of the service, women delivered coffins to the church, claiming they held the bodies of children who had died of cholera. The American troops failed to inspect them. Had they looked, they would have discovered a hidden arsenal of weapons smuggled in by men disguised as grieving women. 20 minutes after the morning call to breakfast, the guerrillas launched a savage assault using bolo knives, picks, and shovels. The attack was so swift that one American soldier was found still leaning forward at the mess table, spoon in hand, his decapitated head resting meters away. Of the 74 men in the company, only 20 survived. Even the company's dog was killed, its eyes gouged out and replaced with stones. Congress held hearings, forcing William Howard Taft to return to Washington for the spectacle. His reassurances that progress was being made towards the Americanization of the island's inhabitants fell largely on deaf ears, especially after he admitted that natives had been tortured on, quote, some occasions. The press seized on his words, and headlines flared. Mark Twain, never one to hold back, suggested that the flag's stripes be painted black and its stars replaced with skull and crossbones. Rather than extract themselves from the situation, the U.S. Army scapegoated a handful of individual soldiers, men who had mostly been following orders to bring peace to the Philippines. This was followed by a hastily issued presidential proclamation declaring the war officially over. Still, Filipinos would not be allowed to convene their first elected assembly for another 5 years. In the meantime, fighting continued across the islands as bands of insurgents clung to the hope that violence might convince the Americans to leave. The toll was staggering. The United States counted over 7,000 casualties, while the Filipinos lost 20,000 soldiers and an estimated 200,000 civilians, many victims of famine and malnutrition. That may seem surprising until one considers that rice, the Filipino staple, depended heavily on the water buffalo for planting and harvesting. In just 3 years of conflict, the population of the water buffalo had declined by 90%. With the worst of the violence pushed into the background, Taft could now focus on his mission to Americanize his wards. Historian Stanley Carnow writes that the governor relied on 3 ingredients he believed had made America great: mass education, economic development, and democratic government. This was the quote-unquote positive face of imperialism. Thousands of trained professionals were dispatched to the islands to bring civilization with them. America aspired to do better than its European peers, rejecting the colonial models of the French and British. Instead, the U.S. aimed to chart its own path. It built dams and spearheaded irrigation efforts, expanded markets through the construction of roads, railways, and ports, and created a stable tax system to support a self-sustaining central economy. Modern hospitals staffed with doctors trained in Western medicine helped double the population between 1900 and 1920. After Aguinaldo's defeat, Filipinos largely bought into the American system of limited self-rule. By 1920, Filipinos outnumbered Americans in the ranks of the army and police. Despite the best intentions, all roads in the Philippines ultimately led back to the United States. The stabilized economy became entirely dependent on American markets. A new ruling class emerged that looked remarkably like the old oligarchy. Wealthy elites empowered to maintain control over the poor. And the influx of American imports stifled the growth of native industry. Yet another example that what's good for the goose isn't always good for the gander. This isn't to say that life didn't improve for many Filipinos. Taft negotiated with the Vatican to purchase land still held by Spanish friars. While these were originally earmarked for tenant farmers, the remoteness of the former haciendas made them unattractive to the island's poor. In 1909, 22,000 hectares were purchased by the American sugar industry, setting off a wave of investment that earned the region the nickname Sugarlandia. The Philippines' unique status meant it remained tariff-free during World War I, at a time when the U.S. sharply increased tariffs on foreign sugar imports. Historian John Larkin notes that this tariff loophole would eventually contribute to Philippine independence. He writes, "On the American side, a major, perhaps the chief impulse towards Philippine independence was the growing threat posed by sugar and coconut oil from the duty-free U.S. market. Politicians and lobbyists from the U.S. Beet Sugar Association, American Sugarcane League, American Farm Bureau Federation, Hawaii Sugar Planters Association, Association of Sugar Producers of Puerto Rico, and corporations heavily invested in Cuban centrals such as National City Bank, United Fruit, and Hershey's Chocolate all joined the campaign. Although Philippine sugar never represented more than a fraction of America's total domestic production, its share of imports grew dramatically from 7.6% in 1921 to 24% just 12 years later. American producers, already stressed by overproduction and falling prices, came to view Philippine sugar as a substantial threat to their profits, and in some cases, to their very survival. The installation of a universal education system had its ups and downs. Many of the mistakes made then are familiar to professional educators today. Errors our modern school systems continue to repeat, rarely learning from their own missteps. First, the schools weren't adequately staffed or equipped. Thousands of American-trained teachers flocked to the Philippines, lured by government salaries far exceeding what they could earn back home. While teachers have always been willing to work for less, they've never stopped hoping to earn more. Many sought adventure in Manila Bay, only to find themselves assigned to remote villages, scattered across the nation's thousands of islands. Tiny places with little to offer in the way of entertainment or support. Work provided no real escape from their dismal, unfulfilled lives. Classrooms were described as dirty and dismal, and teachers often relied on interpreters who spoke little to no English. The second major flaw was that the system failed to focus on its students. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to every rule, but allow me to paint with a broad brush. For the past 2 decades, the American school system has aimed to prepare every student for college, even though many students are either not interested in or not suited for higher education. The result? Hundreds of thousands of young adults burdened with debt after realizing that the college path wasn't for them. In 2024, the Strata Education Foundation reported that 52% of college graduates were underemployed just 1 year after graduation, and 45% remained underemployed a decade later. After years of reflection, the American education system is finally working to reintegrate vocational training, something I actually advocated for as a high school debater 28 years ago. Some students are destined for college and others for the workforce. That's not a bad thing, it's just a fact of life. Our society needs both white and blue-collar professionals to function. The most important message for students is this: not only is there no shame in pursuing a trade, but there's real financial opportunity in doing so. Consider the now viral list from eBaum's World: 16 jobs that surprisingly pay more than a teacher. Among the entries, toll booth worker, butler, and clown. Beyond just college or vocational paths, school communities need to account for geographic and cultural differences in student behavior. Hawaii, for instance, is notoriously challenging for educators. Students frequently skip class to hang out on the beach or hike in the mountains. And who could blame them? Most kids in school dream of one day living in paradise. Hawaiian students are already there. And with the local economy centered around tourism, there's little motivation to focus on core subjects when they could be gaining on-the-job experience instead. When I transferred from a high-achieving, upper-middle-class, predominantly white school to a lower-income, majority African-American school, I made a conscious effort to incorporate more Black history early in the curriculum. What I discovered was a deeper, more complete understanding of American history, one that enriched me both as a teacher and as a student of the past. By focusing on my particular students, rather than relying solely on the textbook, I became a more effective teacher. Unfortunately, the American attempt to educate Filipinos ignored the simple fact that these students weren't American. Stanley Carnow writes that teachers were deluged with memos on their decorum, dress, and haircuts, while their wages were paid erratically. The curriculum better suited Massachusetts than the Philippines. History lessons included George Washington's cherry tree and Paul Revere's midnight ride, American myths passed off as patriotic truth. The Baldwin Reader, a popular American primer, was introduced, teaching A is for apple, a fruit alien to Filipino students. Its main characters, John and Mary, frolicked in the snow, another unfamiliar concept. Now, when I adapted my teaching for a new environment, I modified the content, not the academic rigor. All students can learn when paired with a teacher who understands and connects with them. In the Philippines, however, the education system was based on the philosophy of Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, which emphasized the dignity of common labor. Washington, a pioneering civil rights figure, believed African Americans could gain white respect through elite work ethic and job proficiency in roles deemed, quote, appropriate. But white Americans with implicit biases interpreted this to mean Black men and women were only suited for certain types of labor. White supremacists took it further, using the idea to argue that Black people were intellectually inferior and incapable of higher-level work. The system exported to the Philippines resembled this second-tier model, and some teachers even slid into the third. One such teacher, Harry Cole, wrote home after 4 months, saying, "The more I see of this lazy, dirty, indolent people, the more I come to despise them. I came here to help them, to enter their homes and try to uplift them, but it seems to me a useless task. I am becoming more and more convinced that for years and years to come, the only business Americans ought to have over here is to rule them with severity." Cole's failure was the product of poor preparation, lack of support, and zero cultural understanding. Filipino students skipped class more frequently than he was used to, but that's because their families needed them at home to help on the farm, especially during planting and harvest. This had always been the case, long before compulsory education was introduced. Even wealthy families undermined the system. When gardening was taught as a practical vocational skill, some parents sent their household servants to complete the assignments, viewing manual labor as beneath their children. Over time, the system began to course correct, but that points to yet another reason educational reforms so often fail. Real progress rarely happens gradually. Native Filipino teachers were hired. New textbooks replaced John and Mary with Juan and Maria. Pilot programs brought Filipino students to the U.S. to prove they could thrive in university settings. But instead of returning home as role models, these students were ostracized, viewed as so Americanized that rumor spread of brainwashing. Because the system failed to produce large numbers of college-ready students, it quickly shifted back to vocational training, the very model it had rejected a decade earlier. The final and perhaps most fatal flaw came from an obsession with easily manipulated data. Rather than focusing on students who wanted to be there, Washington demanded high attendance rates to justify funding. So police were sent out each morning to round up children, packing 80 to 100 students into classrooms. After being taught for a day, it might be weeks before the same child returned. This wasn't education. It was theater, and the data looked great on paper. Reports bragged about impressive enrollment numbers, despite the chaos happening behind the scenes. Another misleading stat came from Fred W. Atkinson's successor, David Barrows. Carnow writes that Barrows left behind 4,000 elementary schools by 1909, a threefold increase over 7 years. He doubled student enrollment to over 400,000 and tripled the number of native teachers to 8,000. But the reality was bleak. Most Filipino teachers hadn't progressed beyond 6th grade and functioned merely as classroom monitors. Truancy was rampant, especially among rural children needed for farm work. Of all students who enrolled, only 1/6 reached the 4th grade. The rest dropped out to work. Still, the system had an impact, Americanizing the Filipino people. Today, English remains the primary language across the Philippines' 117 million inhabitants. 13% hold college degrees. That's well below America's 37%, but close to China's 15%. The second ingredient in Taft's plan was economic development. Here, the record is mixed. While Taft worked to modernize the economy, his hands were tied by Congress, where lobbyists fought tooth and nail to protect American industries from foreign competition. Still, Manila was transformed from a neglected outpost into the Pearl of the Orient. One editor from Missouri even declared, "Manila is the most thoroughly typical American city I have ever visited outside the United States." Roads expanded from just 300 miles of first-class routes to over 1,200, with another 3,000 miles of minor roads. The rail system grew sixfold, though never to Taft's satisfaction. He reminded Washington, "Without roads, people are necessarily savages. Society is impossible, and real progress is stymied." The final element of Taft's three-part strategy was democracy. He built institutions from the ground up, starting with local elections. Political philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville once said that town government is the practical way of building up a general government. But centuries of kinship-based politics and America's impatience undermined these efforts. Despite his rhetoric, Taft admitted he couldn't imagine Filipinos truly practicing American-style democracy anytime soon. "The masses are ignorant, credulous, and childlike," he said in the late 1900s. Suffrage was restricted to landowners and taxpayers, meaning only 3% of the population could vote in the 1907 elections. That decision re-empowered the Chinese-descended elite, previously favored under Spanish rule. These early legislatures didn't showcase American ideals so much as they mastered its vices. Corruption soared, cronyism reigned. Perhaps no one embodied this better than Manuel Quezoni Malani, the Senate president. Of Chinese and Spanish descent, Quezoni relished the spotlight. Carnot writes that he adored fine food and good liquor, balls, cabarets, and all-night poker sessions with cronies in smoke-filled rooms. He was a gifted actor who performed the delicate dance of independence. Publicly, Casoni demanded immediate independence. Privately, he worked to delay it, fearing a rival would take credit. He warned one American diplomat, "Give us certainty, and we will take dominion status. But if you quote me, I will say you lie." Casoni's concerns were twofold. First, full independence might cut the Philippines off from vital U.S. trade privileges. Second, without American protection, the islands might fall into the hands of a more aggressive imperial power, like Japan or Great Britain. In this way, both Japan and England were used as boogeymen to maintain the favorable status quo. During Woodrow Wilson's presidency, Congress passed a bill pledging to recognize Philippine independence once the country had a stable government. But when Republicans regained control after World War I, they argued the islands were far from stable. Then came the Great Depression. America's mindset turned inward. The Philippines, seen as a costly and risky outpost, became a liability. Congress passed a bill guaranteeing independence in 10 years. President Herbert Hoover vetoed it, hoping to retain America's largest overseas holding. Congress overrode him 4 days later. Casoni quietly sabotaged the effort, worried his rival would get the glory. Then he reintroduced the bill, slightly revised, and passed it under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The new law promised independence within a decade and created a powerful executive branch that would later enable dictatorship. Casoni became the Philippines' first elected president in 1935, defeating former revolutionary Emilio Aguinaldo. But independence would have to wait a little longer, because Hitler was about to plunge the world into darkness, one that would bring the dreaded Imperial Japanese to the shores of the Philippines. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on the platform formerly known as Twitter. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. Every little bit helps. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.